Okay, this is your Herman Melville Bartleby the Scrivener lecture. Just do this thing together, so let's see how this goes. Here's an image from Google Images of Herman Melville. Can you imagine him as a sailor, as a sailor going after Moby Dick? He was a merchant sailor for a while, Herman Melville, and Billy Budd and Moby Dick were these stories about a sailor after whales and so on. Maybe you've heard of Moby Dick, the great white whale, the story considered his masterpiece, um, also considered one of or maybe the great American novel, this kind of idea that we've been kicking around or maybe we haven't yet, but this is one of the earliest kind of renditions of. We've talked about the novel. What about the great American novel? Later, Mark Twain's Huck Finn seems to be considered a great American novel. This is one of the earlier ones in American literature that's considered the great American novel. Uh, Sailor. He went to sea at age 19 years old. That is, you know, 19 on the high seas chasing whales, I guess, which is something of note. His experience led to literary expressions of, the textbook tells us on page 1132, darkness of human deeds and the evil in nature itself. And so the stories like Bartleby and like Moby Dick and like Billy Budd um, carry this kind of theme around about this like darkness of human deeds, the darkness in Bartleby of um, perhaps of Wall Street, of human greed, even though the story is not a lot about greed. It is a story of Wall Street, after all, which maybe there's some relationship there, which we will talk about, um, or perhaps of nature itself. Remember, we talk about uh, Darwin's theories and the idea. Maybe we haven't talked too much about this either, about the idea of social Darwinism, that people tend to, after Darwin, apply Darwinian thought of natural selection to society, to say that the poorer classes in our society must genetically be predisposed and therefore less advantageous and less adaptable in the society, and that the societies are natural. And there's a theory which is now highly debunked of social Darwinism. And so, anyway, perhaps this is around the time of Darwin's theories of evolution that Herman Melville was writing characters that were representative of the evil in nature itself, that perhaps nature itself has some kind of evil, and maybe that's why Bartleby comes to his end. Moby Dick may be seen as, another quote from the textbook, and another kind of representative theme that we can attach to Bartleby. Moby Dick may be seen as one of the trilogy of three works represent the struggle of humanity against its destiny at various levels of experience. Now, this is a very vague claim by our editors. Various levels of experience. Not sure what we mean by that, what they mean by that, but humanity, struggle of humanity against its nature. Does Bartleby represent? Does Bartleby also represent the struggle of humanity against its destiny? Maybe. I guess it depends on how you kind of think about that. Bartleby, of course, we see this image here from Google Images. I would prefer not to. The I don't know if you can see my cursor here on the recording, but on the image, Bartleby appears to be a scrawny, ghostly type person with his sunken cheeks. In all of the Googled images of Bartleby, he's going to appear in this kind of like mopey type of way, this kind of dark, scrawny type of sad looking kind of creature. And in this image, he appears to be bound by the phrase that he continues to utter. I would prefer not to. The words wrapped around his body like ropes, it looks like. And I don't know, there's something, I guess, between that art and the art in Melville that is kind of accurate, I guess, to describe Bartleby. The story, the subtitle, remember that the subtitle of the story is A Story of Wall Street. We should not forget that. The narrator of the story opens the story. He says, I'm a rather elderly man. The narrator is an old man, retelling his encounter with Bartleby from his past, from the narrator's past. So we have to remember the kind of like place and time when we enter the story, and how it's almost like a frame story, right? We're going back in time from the narrator's perspective, and then we come back into the present by the end of the story, where he tells of the Bartleby's death. A scrivener, if you didn't know, is a copier, a copyist, a human copier. So today we have like copy machines, photocopies. When they had the printing press, they could make multiple copies of the same document. But Melville's story takes place before that machinery of copying, and the scrivener was a copyist, performed the same function. The copyist would copy documents, and it was a long and arduous process. If you know the word scribe, right, it comes from the same, where the B turns to a V, or the V's turn to B's, and from one Spanish language, I think, to the other. Maybe we talked about that already before. The narrator, the next point, is an unambitious, safe lawyer of rich men's bonds and mortgages and title deeds. That's from page 1142. Also, there's a line on page 1142 about how the easiest way of life was the best way of life. That's a particular line that I like. But he's unambitious, he's safe, he plays it safe, and he's also plays it, I guess, fairly wealthy. He's a rich men's bonds lawyer and mortgages and title deeds. And he has this office, and he employs, the next point, 3 people before he employs Bartleby. When the story starts, he has Turkey, Nippers, and Gingernut. All of these are nicknames. And so another level of interpretation that I didn't mention at the last slide has to do with these nicknames. How do we get these nicknames? I mean, obviously, well, the story tells us that they're related to their behaviors and whatnot. So, I don't know. You just think about those little nicknames and who has the power to give a nickname and why and so on. But we have these 3 characters until Bartleby shows up. And the last point, Bartleby does exceptional work as a copyist, but he prefers not to read his copies at first. So that's when he starts saying he's preferred not to, when the narrator asks him to double check basically his work. It's like a revision strategy where they read aloud and check the copy to make sure it's absolutely accurate. He's a law copyist, right? So legal documents need to be accurate. And so Bartleby continues to prefer not to do things he is asked to do. I put that in quotation marks because I think it's really interesting about the boss and employee dynamic in the story. It's not a master-slave dynamic, and so our bosses passive-aggressively ask us to do things, and as employees, we usually courteously do those things because we know that it's not really a request. Our bosses are telling us to do things, but out of politeness, they ask us to do things, and we politely oblige because we're obligated, right? Asked to do. So it's similar to the master-slave dynamic, except that money maybe is part of the equation, in that we put on these kind of niceties in the workplace between our boss and our employees and our employees and so on. But anyway, as Bartleby continues to prefer not to do things he's asked to do by his boss, he frustrates the narrator, who is the boss, until the boss eventually fires Bartleby. Bartleby doesn't leave the office after he's been fired. He's been asked to leave, I think. The narrator gets a new office, so just leaves Bartleby in the old one. And then the new tenants of that office can't get rid of Bartleby either. And so they go and seek out the narrator for help, and the narrator goes to Bartleby at the old office and asks Bartleby to leave, and they have this very interesting conversation about how Bartleby, you could do this and you could do that, and Bartleby keeps saying, I prefer not to, but I'm not particular. It's a difficult story to read. Herman Melville's language is not what we're used to. However, if you do get used to the reading of Herman Melville, I think you can catch a bit of dry wit in the language and the characters. Bartleby continues to say, I'm not particular, yet obviously the things that he prefers not to do indicate that he must have some kind of particularity, yet he continues to claim that he's not particular about what he could do. The narrator suggests, like, maybe you could be a bartender, maybe you could be a travel hand, maybe you could be I don't know, all kinds of different things, and he keeps saying, I don't want to do that, but I'm not particular. So anyway, a bit humorous if you can get through the language, and I think the language is part of its humor too, so it's just a difficulty we have through time. A narrator, next point, the narrator visits Bartleby in jail after Bartleby's arrested. Not sure if I said that part. But Bartleby prefers not to eat, and he starves to death. So that's the end of the story there, and Bartleby's in jail, just on the ground, shriveled up and dead. The narrator, though, concludes the story by saying that he heard this rumor about Bartleby, that Bartleby had worked at the dead letter office, and the narrator suggests that because Bartleby worked at the dead letter office, that he became clinically depressed, and this led to his kind of sanity being lost and depression and his ultimate starving himself to death. The dead letter office, we gather in the story, is that place in the post office where letters go after, how do I put this? The letters were intended for someone who was alive, but in transit, while the letter was in transit, the recipient of the letter died, and the postman had no one to give the letter to, and the postman had to return the letter, not to sender, but to the dead letter office where the letters go to die. And we gather that from the description in the story about how the letter intended for so-and-so, the hand that would have saved it is already dead or whatever. So that's the implication the narrator's making at the end of the story, but I don't know if we're supposed to buy it as readers. The narrator's not super trustworthy, and this is just a rumor after all. So anyway, finally, the last line of the story is, the narrator says, Bartleby, humanity. And so this last line might be quite meaningful if the story is about humanity, especially as we started with in the previous slide. Top of the slide, you see humanity against its destiny. And so Bartleby, against his destiny, dies, fails. Sorry about that. Finally, interpretive work that you could do with Bartleby. You could see some similarities to characters in The Office, which is kind of fun. Uh, does Toby remind you of Bartleby? Um, does the boss remind you, the narrator remind you a bit of Michael Scott? Probably not narration, but the way that he kind of gets angry, but he won't fire. He won't fire Bartleby for refusing to work. And when he does fire him, he doesn't go away. So he's not a very like stern boss. So I wonder if Michael Scott is a good kind of analog for the narrator. Um, Turkey and Nippers. I wonder if they could be considered. Dwight is much like I forget if it's Turkey or Nippers who like threatens to punch Bartleby in the eye. So Dwight is very much like that. I don't know if Jim is so much like the other, but um, I I don't think that in the mopiness, Toby is very much like Bartleby, but Stanley is more an attitude like Bartleby. Stanley's the one who prefers not to do things that are outside of his job description, and so I think maybe Stanley is a bit more like Bartleby than Toby is. Anyway, that's all fun, but I don't know how literary it really is. More to the point, scholars, serious scholars, I misspelled serious there. Um, serious scholarship reaches for the Bible. Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan, about the people who you think would help the person on the side of the road, don't. And actually, the person, the Samaritan or the lawyer, tries to help out this person. The Good Samaritan succeeds, the lawyer fails. So, anyway, there's some similarities to the Good Samaritan, which might be interesting. Bartleby might be seen as a sacrificial character like Jesus. Sorry. Bartleby might be seen as sacrificial. The narrator's faith is in question, right? So the narrator goes to church, but then he. Sorry. Sorry. I don't want to re-record this. I don't have time. Sorry, everybody. The narrator's faith is in question, right? So you remember when the narrator goes to church, walks by the church, doesn't go to church, thinks about going to church, and he pretends to be all good and holy, but is he really? I don't really know. You could think about it. You can make your own kind of judgment there. Man, I sucked at writing this. Bartleby with an A is often described as a ghost, an apparition, a specter. Um, so you might think of like how he might be the living dead, Bartleby. I'm not sure. Or you might think of him as the Holy Ghost. He brings the narrator to salvation. So in the end, when Bartleby dies, does the narrator come to any kind of like rebirth? Right? Maybe not. Maybe that's the point that he doesn't. Is the narrator reliable? This is sort of like in other interpretations, other than biblically. Do we have a reliable narrator here? He often uses these double negatives where he says that Bartleby wasn't not inhumane, or that he was not unhappy, or that he was not in this, not on that. The prefixes that negate the noun or the adjective or whatever the word is, there's a prefix that negates that meaning, but then to add the not to the negative prefix makes it a positive. So to say that someone is not inhumane means technically that they are humane. However, the narrator often uses the double negative. And so I wonder if he can really be trusted if he doesn't really know what he's saying. That's one way to read him. But also, you could take that and read it as a kind of in-between space, right? If it's not inhumane, but it's also not humane, it's somewhere between humane and inhumane, where I don't know what is between those things, but there are multiple places in the story, and especially if we're talking about humanity, um, what's in between, like humanity and not humanity, and animality or whatever. Um, you could also see the in-between space between turkey and nippers. They seem to be opposites. Man, I suck. I keep accidentally clicking on the screen. Presenting. Turkey nippers. Preference, preferring not to do things. He to do versus not to do, right? Bartleby prefers not to do things, but he doesn't actually do or doesn't actually refuse to do. He doesn't demand to do things. He doesn't refuse. He just kind of prefers not to. So I wonder what all of this means symbolically about maybe you could develop some kind of Christianity, Catholic, purgatory in between space type of reading. I'm not sure. Also, another thing to think about is Wall Street. The story could be a critique of, and many people have read it as such, a critique of capitalism as a kind of dictatorship of capitalism, of the proletariat, that Wall Street is that place where all these people make all this money off these other people, and that it's an unhappy kind of miserable existence. And speaking back to the slave and master dynamic, that maybe plays a role. Also, you might think about death and maybe suicide, starving to death, related to the dead letters. Who's dead? Why are they dead? What is death? Is death part of that struggle against humanity and nature and so on and so forth? So anyway, I've said plenty and I've clicked all over the place. Everybody take a look at that, and let me know if you have thoughts. You can email me. I'll create some kind of discussion board or not. And see you on the internet. Bye.